The cemetery stood quiet, its rows of graves bathed in the pale glow of the moonlight. The air was thick with an eerie stillness, broken only by the sound of a dog's desperate barking. But this was no ordinary barking. The dog, a loyal German shepherd named Max, had been sitting by a particular grave for days, refusing to leave. It growled at anyone who came near and seemed almost protective, as though guarding something hidden beneath the earth. What was so special about this grave that it would make the dog act in such a strange and unsettling manner? The police had received numerous calls about the dog's behavior, but when they arrived, they couldn't have imagined the horrifying discovery waiting for them. Beneath the Soil, Part 1. The Dog's Odd Behavior. It all started on an ordinary Tuesday night. The cemetery on the outskirts of town, a place most people avoided after dark, was eerily quiet, but there was something unusual happening near the old graves at the far end of the cemetery. Max, a large German shepherd, had been coming to this spot every night for the past week, his body tense with anxiety. Each time he reached the grave, he would sit, his eyes fixed on it, his tail stiff and his ears perked. The grave in question belonged to an elderly woman, Eleanor Watkins, who had passed away 6 months ago. She had been a well-known figure in the small town, and her death had shocked many. But no one could understand why Max, the local policeman's dog, had become so obsessed with this particular grave. At first, locals thought it was just a fluke. A dog, perhaps, feeling a connection to the land or the scent of something familiar. But the behavior continued, night after night, growing more erratic. Max's owner, Officer Daniels, had noticed the strange behavior and had tried to bring him back home. But Max wouldn't budge. He would whine, dig at the ground, and bark ferociously whenever anyone tried to approach. The officer's concern grew as Max's behavior escalated. It wasn't long before word of the dog's strange antics spread across town. People started to gossip, and rumors about the cemetery began to circulate. Some even whispered that Eleanor Watkins's spirit hadn't left her grave and that Max was reacting to the restless energy that haunted the land. Part 2. The Mysterious Call. Officer Daniels, though skeptical of the supernatural rumors, could not ignore his dog's increasingly bizarre behavior. Max's protective growls grew louder each night, and the dog had even started digging near the grave, his paws frantically pushing at the soil, almost as if he were trying to unearth something. Daniels had no choice but to investigate further. One chilly evening, Daniels arrived at the cemetery with Max by his side. The dog immediately darted toward the same grave, his movements more urgent than ever. As they stood together, the officer felt an unsettling chill in the air. The wind picked up, rustling the dry leaves scattered around the gravestones. But there was something else, something out of place. The moonlight cast long shadows, making the cemetery feel like a scene from a nightmare. Max began to bark incessantly, his eyes fixed on the ground. Daniels bent down to check the grave but saw nothing unusual at first glance. However, something felt wrong. The earth around the grave seemed too disturbed. Loose soil, uneven mounds. It was as if someone had been digging recently. Just as he was about to call for backup, his phone rang. It was an anonymous call. The voice on the other end shaky and urgent. "You need to dig that grave," the voice said before abruptly hanging up. The phone went silent. Officer Daniels, feeling a growing sense of dread, knew this was no prank. He had to investigate. Part 3. A Decision to Dig. The following morning, Daniels called in a few colleagues, including a forensic expert and a local historian, to inspect the grave. As they arrived, the sun was just rising, casting an orange glow over the cemetery. But the feeling of unease still lingered. Max was already there, sitting by the grave, his eyes fixed on the ground. The officers stood around the site, their breaths visible in the cold morning air. After a brief discussion, it was decided they would excavate the grave to see what was causing Max's strange behavior. The forensic expert, Dr. Collins, began to carefully dig into the earth. As the shovel struck the soil, the unmistakable sound of something solid hit the metal. It was strange. The grave had been marked as Eleanor Watkins' burial site, but the ground felt different. The shovel hit a wooden surface. "That's odd," Dr. Collins muttered. "This shouldn't be here." As the soil was cleared away, a wooden casket was revealed. But it wasn't the casket of Eleanor Watkins. It was a much older one, buried deep beneath her grave. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. What was this second casket doing here, and why had it been hidden? Max began to bark even louder, his growls more ferocious. The officers paused, but Daniels nodded to continue. With trembling hands, they pried open the old casket. What they saw next would haunt them forever. Part 4. The Shocking Discovery. Inside the wooden casket, lying in an unnatural position, was the skeletal remains of a person. But it wasn't just any skeleton. The bones were twisted and contorted, almost as if the body had been hastily placed in the grave. Limbs arranged awkwardly. What was more disturbing was the fact that the skeleton had been wearing an old, tattered dress, much like the one Eleanor Watkins had been seen wearing years before she died. Max stopped barking. Instead, he sat silently, his eyes wide, watching the officers. It was as if he knew exactly what they had uncovered. The discovery left everyone in stunned silence. "This doesn't make sense," Officer Daniels said, his voice shaking. "This grave, it isn't Eleanor Watkins after all." Dr. Collins, visibly pale, ran his fingers along the bones. "These remains are much older. This is the body of someone who has been dead for decades. But why would it be buried here, underneath her grave?" The historian stepped forward. "There have been rumors of a terrible secret tied to the Watkins family. Something about the loss of a loved one, a betrayal. But this is beyond anything I could have imagined." Max remained calm, watching the officers as they began to piece together the mystery. The body in the grave was someone with a tragic past, someone whose final resting place had been hidden beneath the grave of Eleanor Watkins. The dog's behavior now made sense. He had been protecting the truth, sensing the disturbance that had been buried for so long. Part 5. Unraveling the mystery. As the days passed, the town was shaken by the discovery. The history of Eleanor Watkins and the mysterious body beneath her grave was revealed. It turned out that Eleanor had once been married to a man named William, a man who had been involved in a series of shady dealings. The second body was believed to be the remains of his first wife, who had mysteriously disappeared years before. Her body had been hidden beneath the grave in an attempt to cover up the crime. Eleanor, it seemed, had known about the secret and had tried to move on. But the past was always lurking, waiting to be uncovered. Max's behavior, it seemed, had been driven by the dog's natural instinct to protect the truth, an instinct that led the officers to uncover the buried secret. The case was closed, but the haunting memories of the discovery would stay with the officers and the town forever. In the end, the mystery was solved, but one question remained. Was it really just a coincidence that Max, the loyal dog, had sensed something that no one else could? Or was there something more to the connection between the living and the dead? Only Max knew for sure. Sometimes the past refuses to stay buried. The unsettling discovery in the cemetery left many with more questions than answers. But one thing was clear. Max, the dog, had played a key role in uncovering a truth that had been buried for far too long. The bond between the living and the deceased is something we may never fully understand, but it's a bond that can sometimes reveal itself in the most unexpected ways. As for Max, his actions left the town forever changed, and the mystery of the grave would remain, a chilling reminder of the secrets that can lie just beneath the surface.